Hello, and welcome to History for Dreaming. Beneath the waves of the Atlantic Ocean, or perhaps the Mediterranean, or maybe somewhere else entirely, there lies a lost civilization, a place of gleaming towers and concentric rings of water. A society so advanced, so perfect, that it became a legend whispered across millennia. And then, in a single day and night, it vanished. Swallowed by the sea, erased from the earth, leaving behind only a story. This was Atlantis. The tale comes to us from one of history's greatest minds. Plato, the philosopher who shaped Western thought, who gave us theories of justice and reality, also gave us this: a detailed account of a mighty island empire that existed 9,000 years before his time. He described its concentric harbors, its golden temples, its vast armies. He wrote of its downfall with the precision of an eyewitness, despite living millennia after the supposed event. Was he recording ancient history, preserving a distant memory passed down through generations? Or was he crafting an elaborate parable, a cautionary tale about power and hubris? For more than 2,000 years, this question has haunted historians, archaeologists, and dreamers. They have searched the oceans, excavated islands, and proposed dozens of locations. They have argued over translations, debated geological evidence, and reinterpreted ancient texts. Some believe Atlantis was real, a Bronze Age civilization destroyed by natural catastrophe. Others insist it was pure fiction, a philosophical thought experiment that took on a life of its own. The truth remains elusive, hidden somewhere between myth and memory. Tonight, we will journey into the world Plato described. We will explore the origins of the Atlantis story and examine every detail he recorded. We will walk the streets of this lost civilization and witness its golden age. We will uncover the theories of where it might have been and why it continues to captivate us. But before we begin, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's such a kind gesture, and it truly helps keep these stories alive, and I'm so grateful for your support. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. Now, simply relax. Allow the busy world to disappear as we travel back to ancient Athens, where a philosopher is about to tell a story that will echo through the ages. Athens, 360 years before the Common Era. The city-state had weathered decades of war, first against Persia, then against Sparta in the long, bitter Peloponnesian conflict. Democracy, that radical experiment in citizen governance, had been tested and nearly broken. The great age of Pericles had passed. The Parthenon stood gleaming on the Acropolis, but the empire that built it was diminished. In this world of fading glory and uncertain futures, an elderly philosopher sat writing dialogues that would shape human thought for millennia. Plato was in his 60s, perhaps older. He had founded his academy, that revolutionary school where students studied mathematics, philosophy, and the nature of reality itself. He had already written many dialogues, those brilliant conversations between his teacher Socrates and various Athenians. The Republic, his masterwork on justice and the ideal state, was complete. Now he was working on a new project, a pair of dialogues that would present his theories on the origin of the universe, the nature of time, and the proper ordering of society. These works would be called Timaeus and Critias, and within them, almost as an aside, he would place a story that would outlive everything else he wrote. The Timaeus opens with a gathering at the house of Critias, a wealthy Athenian. The characters discuss the ideal state, referring back to the conversation in the Republic. Then Critias offers to tell a story, something he heard as a boy from his grandfather, who heard it from Solon, the great lawgiver of Athens. This chain of transmission was important to Plato. He was not presenting a myth or a fable. He was claiming to preserve a historical account, passed down through respectable sources over 2 centuries. According to Critias, Solon had travelled to Egypt around 600 years before the Common Era. In the city of Sais, in the Nile Delta, he conversed with priests who kept records going back thousands of years. These priests told him something remarkable. The Greeks, they said, were like children. Their civilization was young, their memories short. The floods and catastrophes that periodically swept the Mediterranean destroyed their records and scattered their people. But Egypt, protected by the regular, predictable Nile, preserved its histories. And in those histories was an account of a war fought 9,000 years earlier between the ancestors of the Athenians and a mighty empire called Atlantis. The priests described an Athens far older than the Athens Solon knew, a city that existed when the Mediterranean world was very different, when the climate was wetter and the land more fertile. This ancient Athens was, according to the Egyptian account, the perfect embodiment of the ideal state Plato described in the Republic. Its citizens were divided into classes. The warriors were a separate caste, living communally, owning no private property, dedicated entirely to the defense of the city. They were noble, disciplined, and virtuous. They represented everything Plato believed a guardian class should be. Against this ideal, Athens rose an aggressor, an island empire larger than Libya and Asia combined, according to the text. This empire was called Atlantis, and it lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the strait we now call Gibraltar, in the Atlantic Ocean. From this base, the Atlantean kings had conquered much of Europe and Africa. They ruled Libya as far as Egypt and Europe as far as Tyrrhenia, which we know as Tuscany. They were expanding their dominion, pressing into the Mediterranean, threatening to subjugate all the lands around that sea. Only Athens stood against them. The Timaeus gives us this outline, this framework. Then it shifts to other topics, to the creation of the universe and the nature of the soul. The story of Atlantis is left suspended, a tantalizing fragment. Plato promises to return to it, to give us the full account, and in the Critias he does, or rather, he begins to. For the Critias is unfinished, breaking off mid-sentence, leaving the tale incomplete. What we have is extraordinary in its detail. What we lack is any conclusion, any resolution. The dialogue stops just as Zeus is about to pronounce judgment on the corrupt Atlanteans. The punishment, the destruction, the moral of the story, all of this is missing. We are left with a description of a civilization at its height and the promise of its fall, but never the fall itself. This incompleteness has fueled debate for millennia. Did Plato intend to finish it and never did? Did he write an ending that was lost? Or did he deliberately leave it unfinished, trusting his readers to imagine the inevitable doom awaiting a society that abandoned virtue for greed? We cannot know. What we have is what he left us, a fragment preserved in manuscripts copied and recopied across centuries, translated from Greek to Arabic to Latin to every modern language. And within that fragment is a description of a place so vivid, so detailed, that it feels like memory rather than invention. Plato's description of Atlantis is remarkably specific. This is not the vague mythic geography of Homer, where distances are measured in days of sailing and landmarks are more symbolic than real. This is precise, almost technical. He gives us measurements, dimensions, distances. He describes the layout of the city, the construction of its buildings, the arrangement of its agriculture. Reading it feels like reading an architect's proposal or a surveyor's report. The island itself was vast. Plato describes it as larger than Libya and Asia combined, though the exact meaning of these terms in his time is debated. Libya generally meant North Africa, Asia meant Asia Minor. The peninsula we call Anatolia. Together, they would make Atlantis enormous, a landmass perhaps the size of modern Algeria and Turkey together. This poses an immediate problem. There is no sunken landmass of that size in the Atlantic Ocean. The ocean floor has been mapped, the tectonic plates understood. No continent-sized island existed there in human memory and then vanished. If Atlantis was real, either Plato was wrong about its size, or wrong about its location, or using the terms Libya and Asia in a different way than we understand. The island's shape and features are described in careful detail. It was roughly circular, with a central mountain and plain extending to the sea. The mountain was not particularly high, more of a low hill, and upon it was the original settlement. Here, according to Plato, the god Poseidon fell in love with a mortal woman named Cleito. Her parents had died, leaving her alone on this hill. Poseidon, to protect her and to mark the place as his own, broke the land around the hill into alternating rings of water and earth. 2 rings of land, 3 rings of water, all perfectly circular, all centered on the hill where Cleito lived. This was the origin of the city's distinctive layout, created by divine power, not human engineering. But human engineering expanded and perfected it. The later Atlanteans, descendants of Poseidon and Cleito, built upon this foundation. They bridged the rings of water, creating passages from the sea to the innermost circle. They dug a great canal, 300 feet wide and 100 feet deep, cutting through the rings to connect the central island to the ocean. This canal was 50 stadia long, about 6 miles, allowing ships to sail from the open sea directly into the heart of the city. The rings of water became harbours, crowded with vessels from every nation. The rings of land became densely built districts, each more magnificent than the last as one approached the centre. The outermost ring of land was protected by a massive wall, covered in bronze that gleamed in the sun. The metal was not just decorative. Plato describes it as orichalcum, a substance that glowed like fire and was the most precious material in the world after gold. No one today knows what orichalcum was. The word suggests a golden copper, or perhaps an alloy unknown to us. Some have proposed it was amber, others that it was a rare form of brass. Whatever it was, it covered the outer wall, making the city visible from far out at sea, a glowing ring of fire on the horizon. The second ring of land had walls covered in tin. This ring housed the majority of the population, the craftsmen and merchants, the sailors and soldiers who made the empire function. Here were markets and warehouses, shipyards and armories. The inner ring of land was covered in a wall of orichalcum, the same gleaming material as the outermost wall, but more densely applied, more brilliantly polished. This ring was reserved for the nobility, the administrators and priests who governed the empire. The buildings here were grander, the streets wider. Gardens and fountains adorned every space. This was the administrative heart of Atlantis, where decisions affecting millions were made. At the very center, on the original hill, stood the most sacred and impressive structures. The Palace of the Kings was here, a sprawling complex that had been expanded and beautified by 10 generations of rulers. Each king added to it, none ever tearing down what his predecessor built, so it became a labyrinth of halls and courtyards, a living history of the dynasty. The palace was surrounded by gardens watered by 2 springs, one cold and one hot, that flowed from beneath the hill. These springs, Plato notes, were remarkably abundant, providing more than enough water for all the needs of the city. The hot spring was especially valued, diverted into bathhouses, where the people could wash away the weariness of the day. Next to the palace stood the Temple of Poseidon, the grandest religious structure in the world. It was a stadium in length, 3 plethra wide and proportionally high, dimensions that would make it one of the largest buildings of the ancient world. The exterior was covered entirely in silver, except for the roof, which was plated in gold. Inside, the ceiling was of ivory, decorated with gold, silver, and orichalcum in intricate patterns. The statue of Poseidon stood in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses, so tall that his head nearly touched the ceiling. Around him stood 100 Nereids, the sea nymphs, on dolphins. The altar was decorated with inscriptions listing the laws of Atlantis, carved in orichalcum. Outside the city, beyond the rings and harbours, stretched the plain. This was the agricultural heartland of Atlantis, a rectangle of land 3,000 stadia by 2,000 stadia, roughly 340 miles by 230 miles. The plain was surrounded by mountains that sheltered it from the north winds and opened it to the southern breezes. It was naturally fertile, Plato says, the most productive land in the world. But the Atlanteans were not content with natural bounty. They engineered the landscape, cutting a great ditch around the entire perimeter of the plain, 10,000 stadia in circumference, 600 feet wide and 100 feet deep. From this ditch, they cut smaller channels at intervals of 100 stadia, creating a grid of irrigation canals that brought water to every field. The plain was divided into 60,000 allotments, each assigned to a district that would provide 1 man for the army in time of war. This system, Plato notes, could raise an army of over 1 million men from the plain alone, not counting the forces from the city and the other territories of the empire. The engineering required for this division and irrigation was monumental. The main canal alone would have required the excavation of roughly 3 billion cubic feet of earth, a project that would dwarf anything attempted in the ancient world. This level of detail is what makes Atlantis so compelling and so frustrating. Plato gives us numbers, dimensions, systems of organization. He describes the layout with the precision of someone who has walked its streets, and yet none of this can be verified. No archaeological site matches these dimensions. No ancient text outside of Plato mentions this place. We are left with a description that is either a memory of something real, distorted by time and transmission, or a fiction so carefully constructed that it has the texture of truth. The Atlantean Empire, at its peak, was a thalassocracy, a sea power that controlled the waves and the coasts they touched. From their island base beyond the Pillars of Hercules, they extended their influence across vast distances. They ruled, according to Plato, Libya as far as Egypt and Europe as far as Tyrrhenia. This would give them control over the entire western Mediterranean, the coasts of North Africa, Iberia, and Italy. Their fleet was unmatched, their harbours filled with vessels from every corner of the known world. The Atlantean kings were 10 brothers, descended from the 5 sets of twins born to Poseidon and Cleito. The eldest, Atlas, was the supreme king, ruling from the central island. His name, Plato tells us, gave its name to the Atlantic Ocean and to Mount Atlas in North Africa. The other 9 brothers ruled different regions of the island and the empire, but all paid tribute and deference to Atlas. This division of power among brothers, this confederation under a supreme king, was unusual in the ancient world. Most empires were built through conquest and held through force. The Atlantean system, at least as Plato describes it, was based on kinship and mutual oath. Every 5 or 6 years, the 10 kings would gather at the temple of Poseidon for a ceremony that renewed their bond and reaffirmed the laws. Plato describes this ceremony in detail, and it is one of the strangest passages in the Critias. The kings would hunt bulls, sacred animals of Poseidon, that roamed freely within the temple precinct. They would hunt with wooden clubs and ropes only, no metal weapons allowed. This was a ritual hunt, a test of skill and courage. When they captured a bull, they would lead it to the pillar in the temple where the laws were inscribed in orichalcum. There, they would sacrifice it, letting its blood flow over the inscription, mingling with the words of the law. After the sacrifice, they would mix a bowl of wine with a drop of the bull's blood. Each king would drink from this bowl, swearing to uphold the laws and judge according to them. Then they would pour the rest of the wine on the fire as an offering to Poseidon. As darkness fell, they would put on deep blue robes, the color of the sea, and sit in judgment. If any of them had violated the law or wronged another, they would debate the case and pronounce judgment. Their decisions were written on golden tablets and dedicated in the temple as a record. This ritual, repeated every 5 or 6 years, bound the 10 kings together, reminded them of their divine ancestry, and reinforced the sacred nature of their authority. The laws themselves were remarkably restrained, at least as Plato describes the original constitution. The kings could not make war on each other. They must come to each other's aid if one of their number was threatened. Decisions affecting the whole empire required the consent of a majority. No king could put any of his kinsmen to death without the approval of more than half the 10. These laws created a system that balanced centralized authority with distributed power, that prevented tyranny while maintaining order. It was, in many ways, Plato's ideal of mixed government, combining elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and a limited form of democracy. The wealth of Atlantis was legendary, Plato says. The island produced everything needed to sustain life, and much that was desired for luxury. Timber for building, minerals for crafting, herbs for medicine and flavor, all these things grew or were mined in abundance. The mountains yielded gold, silver, copper, and the mysterious orichalcum. The forests provided wood for shipbuilding, furniture, and fuel. The earth produced wheat and barley, vegetables and fruits. Elephants roamed the plains. Plato notes, another detail that has puzzled readers. Were there elephants in the Atlantic? Or is this a sign that Atlantis was elsewhere, in Africa or India perhaps? Or is it simply a fictional element, added to emphasize the richness and diversity of the island's wildlife? Trade brought even more wealth. Ships from every land came to the harbors of Atlantis, bringing exotic goods and new ideas. The city became a cosmopolitan center where Greeks met Egyptians, where African traders exchanged goods with merchants from beyond the Alps. Languages mingled in the markets, different customs and religions coexisted. This international character, this openness to the world, was part of what made Atlantis great. But it also, Plato suggests, planted the seeds of its corruption, exposure to foreign ways, the influx of wealth from trade, the constant arrival of new luxuries. All of this began to erode the original virtue of the Atlanteans. The military might of Atlantis was formidable. From the plain alone, they could raise an army of 60,000 leaders of men, each commanding a unit of followers. The total force, Plato calculates, would include 1,200,000 heavy infantry, 120,000 cavalry, and a fleet of 1,200 ships. These numbers are staggering, far beyond anything achieved in the ancient Mediterranean. The entire Persian Empire, at its height, could not field an army of that size. This is one of the reasons many scholars doubt the literal truth of Plato's account. Either he is exaggerating for effect, or he is describing a civilization on a completely different scale from anything in the Mediterranean Bronze Age, or he is simply inventing numbers to illustrate the overwhelming power that threatened ancient Athens. The navy was the true strength of Atlantis, the instrument of its empire. The 1,200 ships represented not just military vessels, but a complete maritime infrastructure. There were warships, swift triremes with bronze rams designed to punch through enemy hulls. There were transport vessels, broad-beamed ships capable of carrying hundreds of soldiers and their equipment across open ocean. There were merchant ships that brought the wealth of the world to Atlantean harbors. And there were specialized vessels, floating workshops and supply ships that allowed the fleet to operate far from home ports for extended periods. Shipbuilding in Atlantis was a refined art passed down through generations of craftsmen. The naval architects understood hull design, knew how to shape timbers to create vessels that were both fast and stable. They selected woods carefully, using dense, rot-resistant heartwood for the keel and frames, lighter wood for planking and decks. They treated the wood with pitch and oil to protect it from shipworms and decay. The largest warships took years to build, with hundreds of workers involved in the construction. Each vessel was a massive investment, representing thousands of hours of skilled labor and vast quantities of materials. The shipyards occupied an entire section of the outer ring, a vast complex of slipways and workshops. Trees were brought from the mountains and stored in covered sheds to season. Forges produced the bronze fittings, the nails and bolts and chains that held the ships together. Rope walks stretched for hundreds of feet, where workers twisted hemp and flax into cables strong enough to hold masts and anchor the vessels in storms. Sailmakers cut and sewed the great sheets of canvas that would catch the wind. Every craft necessary to maritime power was represented here, working in coordinated efficiency. The crews who sailed these ships were professionals, not pressed men or slaves. They trained constantly, learning to work together with the precision necessary to handle a large vessel in all conditions. The rowers who powered the warships developed extraordinary strength and endurance, able to maintain a racing stroke for hours. The sailors who managed the rigging could climb the masts in any weather, reef the sails in a gale, and navigate by stars. The officers who commanded the ships studied the winds and currents, learned to read the sea and sky for signs of coming weather, and understood tactics and strategy. Yet despite this power, despite their wealth and their advanced engineering, the Atlanteans were not invincible. They were not gods, merely men with divine ancestry now distant and diluted. And men, Plato believed, were always vulnerable to corruption. The very success of Atlantis, its wealth and power, created the conditions for its fall. When you have everything, when no external enemy threatens you, when your barns are full and your treasuries overflow, what keeps you virtuous? What prevents you from sliding into luxury, greed, and pride? This was the question at the heart of Plato's political philosophy, and Atlantis was his answer, his cautionary tale about what happens when even the best-ordered state loses sight of virtue. For many generations, the Atlanteans preserved the character of their divine founder. They were temperate in their desires, noble in their conduct, and wise in their judgments. They valued virtue over wealth, friendship over possessions. When conflicts arose, they resolved them through reason and law, not violence. They pursued knowledge, developing astronomy, mathematics, and engineering to levels that would not be matched for thousands of years. This was the golden age of Atlantis, when its power was tempered by wisdom, when its wealth was used for the common good. The education of young Atlanteans emphasized physical and mental discipline. Boys trained in athletics and warfare, learning to use their bodies as instruments of both grace and power. They studied music and poetry, training their minds to appreciate beauty and rhythm. Mathematics and geometry were taught as paths to understanding the fundamental order of the universe. Philosophy, the love of wisdom, was considered the highest pursuit, the activity that separated humans from beasts and brought them closer to the divine. Women in Atlantis, according to Plato's account, were educated alongside men, at least in the guardian class. This was a radical idea in Athens, where women were largely confined to domestic roles. But in Plato's ideal state, and presumably in the original Atlantis that embodied that ideal, women could be warriors and philosophers if they had the natural aptitude. They trained in the gymnasium, studied in the academy, and participated in the governance of the state. This equality was not born from modern notions of rights, but from Plato's belief that virtue and ability were not determined by sex, that the soul had no gender. The city itself was a marvel of urban planning. The concentric rings created natural districts, each with its own character and function. The outermost ring was industrial, loud with the sounds of shipyards and smithies, busy with the loading and unloading of cargo. The middle ring was residential and commercial, home to the bulk of the population, alive with markets and schools, temples and theatres. The inner ring was governmental and ceremonial, quieter, more ordered, where the serious business of state was conducted, and at the centre, the sacred precinct, where the past was honoured and the gods were worshipped. Streets radiated from the centre like spokes on a wheel, crossing the rings at regular intervals. These streets were wide, paved with stone, lined with shade trees. Fountains and public baths were scattered throughout the city, fed by the abundant springs. Drainage systems carried away waste, keeping the city clean and healthy. The Atlanteans understood the importance of sanitation, of fresh water and clean streets, for maintaining the health of a large urban population. Their engineering in this regard surpassed anything achieved in Greece or Rome for centuries to come. The Temple of Poseidon was not just a place of worship, but a centre of learning and law. Attached to it was a great library where records were kept and scholars studied. The laws inscribed on the orichalcum pillar were supplemented by thousands of scrolls containing legal precedents, philosophical treatises, scientific observations, and historical chronicles. Scribes worked constantly, copying these texts, translating works from other languages, preserving knowledge. The Library of Atlantis, if it existed, would have rivaled the Great Library of Alexandria, which would not be built for another 800 years after Plato's time. Science and technology flourished in this environment. Astronomers mapped the movements of the planets and stars with impressive accuracy. They understood that the Earth was a sphere, that the Sun was larger than it appeared, that eclipses could be predicted. They developed a calendar based on the solar year, divided into months and weeks, that allowed them to coordinate agricultural activities and religious festivals. Their calendar was more accurate than the lunar calendars used by most ancient peoples, avoiding the drift between the seasons and the months. Engineering reached heights that would not be seen again for millennia. The great canal that connected the sea to the city centre, the irrigation system that watered the plain, the bridges that spanned the rings of water, all of these required advanced understanding of hydraulics, structural mechanics, and materials science. They built aqueducts to bring fresh water from the mountains to the city. They constructed harbours with breakwaters and lighthouses to guide ships safely to port. They dredged channels to keep the harbours from silting up, a constant challenge in any maritime city. Medicine was also advanced. Physicians understood the importance of cleanliness, of diet, of exercise in maintaining health. They had developed surgical techniques, using bronze instruments to set broken bones, remove tumours, and repair wounds. They knew the medicinal properties of hundreds of plants and used them to create drugs for pain, fever, and infection. The hot springs were used therapeutically, with different pools at different temperatures for treating various ailments. Hospitals were attached to the temples, where the sick could receive care from priests who were also trained physicians. The arts flourished in this atmosphere of prosperity and learning. Sculptors created works of breathtaking beauty, capturing the human form with a realism and grace that expressed both physical perfection and inner character. Painters decorated the walls of temples and palaces with frescoes showing scenes from mythology, history, and daily life. Potters produced vessels of extraordinary refinement, both functional and beautiful. Metalworkers crafted jewelry, weapons, and ceremonial objects of gold, silver, and bronze, often inlaid with precious stones or decorated with intricate patterns. Music was considered essential to education and to the proper ordering of the soul. Young people learned to play the lyre and the flute, instruments that Plato believed cultivated harmony and balance. Choruses performed at religious festivals, their voices blending in complex polyphonic arrangements. The theatre was a place of both entertainment and moral instruction, where tragedies explored the consequences of hubris and comedies mocked vice and folly. Drama was not mere spectacle, but a way of examining life, of holding up a mirror to society. Philosophy, the love of wisdom, was the highest pursuit. Thinkers debated the nature of reality, the meaning of justice, the best way to live. They asked whether virtue could be taught, whether the soul was immortal, whether the world was eternal or created. These were not idle questions, but urgent inquiries into the fundamental structure of existence. The philosophers of Atlantis, according to Plato, understood what later Greeks would struggle to grasp, that the material world was a shadow of a higher reality, that true knowledge came from reason, not from the senses, that the good was the ultimate principle underlying all existence. Daily life in Atlantis followed rhythms that balanced work and leisure, duty and pleasure. Citizens rose with the dawn, when the city was cool and fresh from the night breezes. The working day began early, with markets opening and craftsmen returning to their workshops. The harbours came alive with activity as ships prepared to depart with the morning tide or arrived after overnight voyages. Fishermen brought in their catches, and the docks filled with the sound of buyers negotiating prices, porters hauling cargo, and ship captains shouting orders. The public baths opened at midday, when the sun was high and hot. Citizens of all classes mingled in the pools, the heat dissolving social distinctions. The hot springs provided water at different temperatures, and bathers moved from hot to cool pools in sequence, cleansing their bodies and relaxing their minds. Masseurs worked oil into tired muscles. Conversations ranged from politics to philosophy, from gossip to serious business negotiations. The baths were more than places to wash. They were social centers where community bonds were reinforced. Meals were communal affairs, especially among the guardian class. The evening meal was served in common dining halls, where citizens gathered to eat and talk. The food was simple but abundant, focused on nutrition rather than luxury. Bread and olive oil, fish and vegetables, fruit and cheese, wine mixed with water. The conversation mattered more than the cuisine. Older citizens shared wisdom with younger ones. Veterans told stories of campaigns and battles. Travelers described distant lands. The dining halls served as informal academies where knowledge was transmitted across generations. Evening brought performances and public gatherings. The theatre hosted both tragedies and comedies, drawing crowds that filled every seat. The performances were not mere entertainment, but civic rituals that explored moral questions and reinforced shared values. Religious festivals occurred throughout the year, marking the changing seasons and honoring various gods. These festivals included processions, sacrifices, athletic competitions, and feasts. They bound the community together through shared worship and celebration. The nights were quiet, with citizens retiring early to rise with the sun. Oil lamps provided light for those who needed to work or study after dark, but fuel was expensive and most activities ceased at sunset. The city settled into darkness, with only the watchfires on the walls and the lighthouses in the harbours burning through the night. Guards patrolled the streets, ensuring order and safety. The city slept, gathering strength for the next day's labors. This golden age could not last forever. Nothing human ever does. The very perfection of Atlantean society contained the seeds of its own destruction. When life is too easy, when challenges disappear, when security is taken for granted, humans tend to forget the virtues that made their success possible. They become complacent, self-indulgent, focused on pleasure rather than duty. This was the pattern Plato saw in Athens, in the generations after the Persian Wars. The city that had defended Greece against the greatest empire in the world became corrupted by its own success, eventually losing the Peloponnesian War to Sparta. Atlantis, he suggested, followed the same path, but on a grander scale. For many generations, the divine nature of their ancestry dominated in the Atlantean character. They possessed true and in every way great qualities of mind, practicing gentleness and wisdom in their relationships with one another and with the vicissitudes of life. They looked down on everything except virtue, thinking lightly of their current possessions and bearing the burden of their gold and other properties easily, as if they were a load. They were not intoxicated by luxury, nor did wealth deprive them of self-control. Rather, in their soberness, they clearly perceived that all these goods are increased by mutual friendship combined with virtue, and that through excessive zeal for possessions and honors, those very things are destroyed along with virtue. But slowly, inexorably, this divine portion began to fade. It became diluted through frequent mixing with mortal nature. The human element began to predominate. Those who could perceive such things saw that the Atlanteans were becoming corrupted, losing the fairest of their most precious gifts. To those who could not perceive the true life of happiness, they appeared at their very finest and most blessed, at the very time when they were filled with lawless greed and power. This was the terrible irony, Plato notes. At the moment of their greatest apparent success, when their empire was largest and their wealth most abundant, they were actually in decline, rotting from within. The signs of corruption were subtle at first. The kings began to extend the intervals between their sacred gatherings, meeting every 6 years rather than 5, then less frequently still. The ritual of the bull hunt became perfunctory, less a test of courage than a ceremonial formality. Some kings even began to use metal weapons in the hunt, violating the ancient custom. The oaths they swore over the blood-mixed wine became empty words, spoken from habit rather than conviction. The golden tablets recording their judgments piled up unread in the temple, their wisdom ignored. Wealth, once viewed with indifference, became an obsession. The kings competed with each other in displays of luxury, each trying to outdo the others in the magnificence of his palace, the size of his fleet, the number of his servants. They imposed heavier tributes on their subjects to fund these vanities. The common people, seeing their rulers' example, pursued their own enrichment with similar fervor. Merchants engaged in sharp practices, cheating customers and adulterating goods. Craftsmen cut corners, producing inferior work. The bonds of trust that held society together began to fray. The military, once disciplined and restrained, became aggressive and expansionist. The generals argued for new conquests, not for defense or even strategic advantage, but for glory and plunder. The army that had been maintained to protect the empire from external threats was turned outward, seeking new lands to dominate, new peoples to subjugate. The wars became more frequent, more brutal. Prisoners were no longer treated with the restraint that divine ancestry required, but were enslaved or slaughtered. The rules of warfare that had limited violence were abandoned. Education declined in quality and purpose. The gymnasiums that had trained both body and mind became mere athletic facilities, focused on competitive victory rather than harmonious development. The schools that had taught philosophy and mathematics became training grounds for sophistry and rhetoric, teaching young men how to win arguments rather than how to discover truth. The study of music shifted from complex, morally elevating compositions to simple, emotionally manipulative popular songs. The theatre abandoned tragic depth for sensationalistic melodrama and crude comedy. Family structures began to break down. The traditional respect for elders eroded. Young people, flush with wealth and opportunity, ignored the wisdom of their parents and grandparents. Marriage, once a sacred bond entered into with solemnity and mutual respect, became a casual arrangement, easily made and easily dissolved. Children were raised by nurses and tutors rather than parents, growing up without the moral grounding that comes from familial love and discipline. The household, which Plato considered the foundation of the state, became unstable. Women of the guardian class, who had once trained alongside men and participated in governance, were increasingly relegated to decorative roles. Their education became superficial, focused on appearance and social graces rather than virtue and wisdom. The principle of equality based on merit was abandoned in favor of traditional gender hierarchies. This represented a fundamental betrayal of the original Atlantean values, a regression to conventional prejudices. Religion became a matter of external show rather than inner conviction. The temples grew more magnificent, their decorations more lavish, but the genuine piety diminished. People attended ceremonies from social obligation or political calculation, not from true reverence for the gods. The priests became wealthy and worldly, more concerned with their privileges and incomes than with their sacred duties. Sacrifices were offered mechanically, prayers recited without feeling. The connection between the human and divine realms, which had once been vibrant and real, faded into mere formality. Philosophy, that highest pursuit, became corrupted into sophistry. Teachers arose who claimed to teach virtue for a fee, as if wisdom were a commodity that could be bought and sold. They taught their students techniques of argumentation that could make the weaker case appear stronger, that could justify any action, that could rationalize any vice. They denied the existence of absolute truth, claiming that all values were relative, that might made right, that the only real good was pleasure. These ideas, Plato believed, were poison to the soul and to society. The laws, once simple and just, became complex and manipulable. Lawyers and judges found loopholes and exceptions. The spirit of the law was ignored in favor of technical compliance. The wealthy could afford skilled advocates who could twist any statute to their advantage. The poor received summary justice, harsh and arbitrary. The legal system, which had been designed to maintain fairness and resolve disputes peacefully, became an instrument of oppression and a source of profit for the corrupt. Trade, once a means of acquiring necessities and fostering international friendship, became an end in itself. Merchants pursued profit without regard for the quality of their goods or the welfare of their customers. They dealt in slaves, treating human beings as commodities. They smuggled weapons to warring states, profiting from conflict and suffering. They engaged in price manipulation and hoarding, creating artificial scarcity to drive up their profits. The marketplace, which had been a place of honest exchange, became a den of thieves. The Atlanteans began to look with contempt on other peoples. Their military successes, their technological advances, their wealth, all of this bred arrogance. They saw themselves as inherently superior, destined to rule, entitled to the obedience and resources of lesser nations. This hubris, this overweening pride, was the gravest of all their sins. For the Greeks, hubris was the characteristic vice that brought down heroes and nations. It was the belief that one was equal to or greater than the gods, that one was exempt from the moral laws that governed other humans. And hubris, inevitably, brought nemesis, divine retribution. The Atlantean Empire, in its corruption, turned its gaze toward the eastern Mediterranean. Egypt, wealthy and ancient, tempted them. The Greek city-states, divided and quarrelsome, seemed easy prey. The Atlantean kings assembled their vast military forces, the 1,000,000-man army and the 1,200-ship fleet, and launched an invasion. They swept through the Strait of Gibraltar, their ships darkening the sea. They landed on the coasts of Libya and began their march eastward. City after city fell before them. Resistance was crushed with overwhelming force. Within a remarkably short time, they had conquered all of Libya up to the borders of Egypt, and all of Europe up to Tyrrhenia. Egypt, with its ancient wisdom and organized military, managed to hold out. The priests and pharaohs rallied their forces and defended the Nile Delta. But it was Athens that truly stood against the invaders. This was the ancient Athens, not the Athens of Plato's day, but the Athens of 9,000 years before, the perfect embodiment of the ideal state. Its warriors, trained from childhood in discipline and virtue, possessed none of the material wealth of the Atlanteans, but they had something more valuable. They had courage, unity, and the favor of the gods. The Athenian forces, vastly outnumbered, employed superior tactics and strategy. They did not meet the Atlantean army in open battle, where numbers would overwhelm them, but used the terrain to their advantage. They struck at supply lines, ambushed isolated units, defended choke points where the enemy's numbers meant nothing. They were not fighting for conquest or plunder, but for survival, for their homes and families, for the principle that right was stronger than might. This gave them a moral clarity and determination that the mercenary forces of Atlantis lacked. The war, according to the fragmentary account in the Timaeus, turned in Athens' favor. The Atlantean advance was halted, then reversed. The invaders were driven back from the Greek mainland. Their allies in Europe and Libya began to defect, sensing that the tide had turned. The Atlantean fleet, harassed by storms and attacked by Athenian triremes, suffered heavy losses. The great invasion, which had seemed unstoppable, faltered and began to collapse. But before the war could reach its conclusion, before Athens could press its advantage and perhaps even carry the fight to Atlantis itself, something happened. The gods intervened. Zeus, the king of the gods, the upholder of cosmic justice, looked down upon the earth and saw what Atlantis had become. He saw the corruption, the cruelty, the hubris. He saw a people who had forgotten their divine ancestry, who had abandoned virtue for greed, who had turned the gifts of the gods into instruments of oppression, and he determined that they must be punished. Here, frustratingly, the Critias dialogue breaks off. Plato writes that Zeus, beholding the corruption, collected all the gods into their most holy habitation, which, being placed in the center of the world, beholds all created things. And when he had called them together, he spoke as follows. And then nothing. The manuscript ends. We never learn what Zeus said, never witness the punishment he decreed. We are left to imagine the catastrophe that followed, using only the brief mention in the Timaeus as a guide. The Timaeus tells us that there were earthquakes and floods of extraordinary violence. In a single day and night, the Athenian warriors were swallowed up by the earth. At the same time, the island of Atlantis was swallowed by the sea and vanished. This was not a gradual decline or a conquered territory absorbed into another empire. This was total annihilation, complete erasure. The greatest city in the world, with its concentric rings and gleaming walls, its temples and palaces, its libraries and treasuries, all of it sank beneath the waves in one day and one night. The millions of people who lived there, the accumulated wisdom of generations, the art and technology and philosophy, all lost. The ocean closed over the ruins, and within a generation, Atlantis was forgotten by the world, preserved only in Egyptian records and eventually in Plato's dialogues. The mechanism of this destruction has been debated for centuries. Plato speaks of earthquakes and floods, which suggests a natural disaster rather than direct divine intervention. Perhaps a massive earthquake caused the island to sink, a subsidence of the ocean floor. Perhaps a tsunami, triggered by an underwater earthquake or a volcanic eruption, swept over the island and drowned it. Perhaps both occurred together, the earthquake shattering the buildings and the tsunami washing away the ruins. Any of these scenarios is geologically plausible, though finding evidence for a specific event 9,000 years before Plato's time is, of course, impossible. Some interpreters have suggested that the destruction was metaphorical rather than literal. The sinking of Atlantis represented the collapse of a corrupt society under the weight of its own vices. The flood was not water, but barbarism, the loss of civilization, the return to chaos. This reading makes Atlantis entirely allegorical, a parable with no historical basis. But Plato's detailed description of the geography and the specificity of the 9,000-year timeline argue against this interpretation. If it were merely an allegory, why provide so much precise detail? Why anchor it to a specific time and place? The fate of the Athenian warriors is even more puzzling. They too were swallowed up by the earth on the same day Atlantis sank. How could this be? Were they on the island when it sank? Had they invaded Atlantis and were destroyed with it? Or did a separate earthquake strike Greece at the same moment, a double catastrophe that erased both the aggressor and the defender? Plato gives us no answers, leaving us to speculate about the mechanics of this divine judgment. What is clear is that Plato intended this as a moral tale. Atlantis fell not because it was weak, but because it was corrupt. Its wealth and power, unmoored from virtue, became the instruments of its destruction. The lesson was directed at Athens, at the Greece of Plato's own time, the city that had saved Greece from Persia, that had created democracy and produced Socrates, was in danger of following the same path. It had become imperialistic, greedy, and divided. It had lost the Peloponnesian War through its own hubris and folly. If Athens did not return to virtue, Plato was warning, it would suffer the fate of Atlantis. For more than 2,000 years, readers have asked the same question: was Atlantis real? Did Plato preserve a genuine historical memory, or did he invent the entire story as a philosophical parable? The evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. On one hand, no ancient source before Plato mentions Atlantis. Neither Homer nor Hesiod, neither Herodotus nor Thucydides makes any reference to a vast Atlantic empire that fought ancient Athens. The Egyptian records that Plato claims as his source have never been found. No archaeological evidence of Atlantis has ever been verified, despite centuries of searching. On the other hand, Plato presents the story as history, not myth. He provides a detailed chain of transmission from Egyptian priests to Solon to Critias. He gives specific measurements and descriptions that suggest first-hand knowledge, or at least access to detailed sources. He anchors the story in a specific time, 9,000 years before Solon, which would place Atlantis around 9,600 BCE, near the end of the last ice age. This was a time of dramatic climatic change, when sea levels were rising as the glaciers melted, when coastlines were shifting, when entire landscapes were being transformed. Could some great civilization have existed then and been destroyed by the changing climate? The search for Atlantis has taken investigators to every corner of the globe. Some have looked in the Atlantic Ocean itself, searching for a sunken landmass between Europe and America. The mid-Atlantic ridge, a chain of underwater mountains, was once proposed as the remains of Atlantis. But geological surveys have shown that this ridge has never been above sea level in human history. It is not a sunken continent, but an active spreading zone where new ocean floor is constantly being created. No large island has ever existed there and then sank. Others have turned to the Mediterranean, arguing that Plato or his sources were mistaken about the location. The most popular Mediterranean candidate is Santorini, the Greek island known in ancient times as Thera. Around 1600 BCE, Santorini experienced one of the largest volcanic eruptions in recorded history. The center of the island exploded, leaving a caldera that filled with seawater, creating the distinctive crescent shape the island has today. The eruption generated tsunamis that struck Crete and the surrounding islands, possibly contributing to the decline of the Minoan civilization. The parallels to Atlantis are intriguing. Santorini was a wealthy, sophisticated society with advanced architecture and engineering. It was destroyed suddenly by a natural catastrophe involving earthquakes and floods. The circular shape of the flooded caldera resembles Plato's description of Atlantis with its concentric rings. However, the timeline is wrong. Santorini exploded in 1600 BCE, not 9600 BCE, and it was not larger than Libya and Asia combined, but a small island in the Aegean. If Santorini is Atlantis, then Plato was mistaken about nearly every detail, and the story becomes almost useless as a historical source. Some investigators have proposed that Atlantis was not in the Mediterranean or Atlantic at all, but somewhere else entirely. Suggestions have included Antarctica, Indonesia, the North Sea, the Caribbean, and the Black Sea. Each of these proposals relies on interpreting Plato's text in creative ways, arguing that beyond the Pillars of Hercules might not mean the Atlantic, or that the dimensions given are symbolic rather than literal, or that the 9,000 years refers to seasons or months rather than solar years. While some of these ideas are ingenious, they all require us to assume that Plato was deeply confused or deliberately misleading in his description. The most skeptical scholars argue that Atlantis is entirely fictional, a thought experiment that Plato created to illustrate his political philosophy. The ideal state he described in the Republic was Athens as it should be, a perfect society governed by philosopher kings. Atlantis was the opposite, a society that began well but was corrupted by wealth and power. The contrast between virtuous Athens and corrupt Atlantis was meant to teach a moral lesson, not to preserve a historical memory. The detailed descriptions were simply Plato's literary skill at work, creating a vivid fictional world the way Homer created Troy and Ithaca. This interpretation gained support from the fact that the Critias dialogue was apparently never finished. If Plato were recording a historical account passed down from Egyptian priests, why would he abandon it mid-sentence? But if he were creating a philosophical parable, he might have decided that the point had been made, that the description of Atlantis at its height and the hints of its corruption were sufficient, that the actual destruction need not be described in detail. The incompleteness of the dialogue suggests literary creation rather than historical preservation. Yet the story refuses to die. Every few years, a new claim emerges, a new location is proposed, new evidence is presented. Archaeologists discover an ancient city with advanced engineering, and someone suggests it might be Atlantis. Geologists identify a tsunami deposit or an earthquake fault, and the connection to Plato's account is made. The search continues because the story touches something deep in the human imagination, the idea of a lost golden age, a perfect society that fell from grace, a warning from the past about the fragility of civilization. In our own time, Atlantis has taken on new meanings. To some, it represents lost ancient wisdom, advanced technology that modern science has yet to rediscover. To others, It symbolizes the danger of environmental catastrophe, a civilization destroyed by its failure to live in harmony with nature. To still others, it is a reminder of human hubris, the belief that our power and knowledge make us invulnerable to disaster. Each age, each generation, finds in Atlantis the lessons it needs, the warnings it must hear. Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, used Atlantis to warn Athens about the consequences of imperialism and moral decay. His readers, living through the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War, watching their city decline from the heights of the 5th century, understood the message. We, living in an age of environmental crisis, nuclear weapons, and rapid technological change, read the story differently. We see in the sudden destruction of Atlantis our own fears about climate change, about the collapse of civilizations, about the unintended consequences of our powers over nature. Whether Atlantis was real or invented, whether it lies beneath the Atlantic or the Mediterranean or nowhere at all, the story endures. It endures because it speaks to fundamental human concerns about power and virtue, about success and failure, about the rise and fall of civilizations. It reminds us that no matter how advanced we become, no matter how secure we feel, we are always vulnerable to catastrophe, always dependent on maintaining our moral foundations, always subject to forces larger than ourselves. The concentric rings of Atlantis, the gleaming walls, the great plain, the temple of Poseidon, all of this may be fiction. But the truth the story carries, the warning about corruption and hubris, the reminder of civilization's fragility, this is real. This is what Plato wanted us to remember. Not the precise location of a sunken island, but the eternal truth that virtue is the only secure foundation for any society, that wealth and power without wisdom lead to destruction, that the gods, or fate, or the impersonal forces of history will bring down the mighty who forget justice. And so the search continues, not because we expect to find the ruins of Atlantis beneath the waves, but because the search itself is meaningful. It reminds us to look at our own civilization with critical eyes, to ask whether we are building on solid foundations of virtue or on the shifting sands of greed and pride. It encourages us to study the past, to learn from the fallen empires and vanished cultures, to understand that we are not exempt from the patterns of history. It keeps alive the dream of a better world, even as it warns us about the ease with which dreams can become nightmares. Plato gave us Atlantis as a gift, a story that would challenge and inspire and warn every generation that read it. We may never know if he was recording history or creating fiction, but we know that the story has shaped our imagination, influenced our culture, and carried its message across more than 2 millennia. That is a kind of immortality that Atlantis, whether real or imagined, has achieved. Not the immortality of buildings and monuments, which even the greatest empires see crumble, but the immortality of ideas, which endure as long as there are minds to contemplate them. Tonight, we have journeyed into one of history's deepest mysteries. We have walked the streets of a lost civilization, witnessed its glory and its fall, and pondered the meaning of its story. Whether Atlantis ever existed, it exists now, in every retelling, in every search, in every warning about the fragility of civilization. It is a mirror we hold up to ourselves, asking what we see, what we should fear, what we should aspire to become. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey tonight. I hope you've enjoyed exploring this ancient mystery, and I hope it gives you something to think about as you drift off to sleep. Pleasant dreams, and I'll see you again soon for another journey into history.